Picture this. It's a quiet evening in April 1990. You're inside a sacred Mormon temple, a place of peace and reverence. Suddenly, during the most solemn part of the ceremony, you're instructed to make a gesture across your own throat, symbolizing a penalty. Now, imagine just one day later, that entire part of the ceremony is gone, vanished. What happened, and why? If you're fascinated by the hidden histories and sudden shifts within Mormonism, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our Mormon deep dive, because today we are re-peeling back the curtain on one of the most significant and secretive changes in modern church history, the 1990 Temple Endowment overhaul. You won't want to miss this. For over a century, the Latter-day Saint endowment ceremony included what were known as the penalties. These were symbolic gestures participants made, representing the consequences they would suffer if they ever revealed the sacred secrets of the temple. The most infamous of these was a motion across the throat, another across the chest, and a third across the abdomen. They were graphic, to say the least, and were directly linked to oaths of secrecy taken by participants. The wording was intense, covenanting that rather than reveal the temple tokens and signs, they would suffer my life to be taken. Then, on April 10, 1990, without any public announcement or explanation, it all changed. Temple patrons who attended the ceremony one day and went back the next were met with a completely revised ordinance. The penalties were gone, the oaths were softened, the gestures simulating self-harm were completely removed. It was an abrupt and silent revolution within the church's most sacred ritual. So, the big question is, why? Why would the church suddenly remove something that had been a core part of its most sacred ceremony for more than 140 years? The official reason has never been publicly stated by the First Presidency. This silence has led to a lot of speculation, but by piecing together historical context and insider accounts, we can get a pretty clear picture. Let's look at the first major reason. Public perception and ex-Mormon exposes by the late 1980s, the so-called anti-Mormon movement was gaining steam, largely thanks to the new accessibility of video technology. For the first time, individuals who had left the church could not only describe the secret temple ceremonies, but could also film themselves reenacting them, including the shocking penalties. One of the most famous examples was a film called The Godmakers. This film, and others like it, depicted the temple ceremony in a way that was frankly horrifying to outsiders. The throat-slitting gesture, in particular, was used to paint the church as a sinister, secretive cult. This negative PR was a huge problem. The church was trying to mainstream itself to be seen as a global Christian faith. Graphic, Masonic-style penalties didn't exactly fit that image. Think about it from a missionary perspective. You're a young missionary in, say, Germany or France, trying to convince a family that your church is all about Jesus and family values. Then they see a video online showing a reenactment of people pantomiming their own death in your temples. That's a conversation killer. The penalties were becoming a massive liability for the church's growth and its public relations efforts, especially here in Europe, where the church was working hard to establish a foothold. But here's a twist you might not expect. The pressure wasn't just coming from the outside, it was also coming from within. Many faithful members of the church were deeply uncomfortable with the penalties. Imagine being a new convert, excited to go to the temple for the first time, an experience you've been told is the spiritual pinnacle of your life. And then you're asked to make these gestures. For many, it was spiritually jarring and frightening, feeling more Masonic and occult than Christian. We have accounts from temple workers and patrons at the time who described people being visibly shaken. Some members even stopped attending the temple altogether because of the penalties. The church collects feedback, and the leadership would have been well aware of this internal discomfort. The changes weren't just a PR move. They were also a pastoral one, designed to make the temple a more positive and less frightening experience for the members themselves. For a church that places so much emphasis on the temple, high levels of member discomfort would be a serious red flag for the leadership. So, what exactly changed? It wasn't just the removal of the penalties, the entire ceremony was streamlined. The lecture at the Veil, a long, repetitive question-and-answer session, was significantly shortened. The role of women in the ceremony was also subtly altered. Prior to 1990, women covenanted to hearken to their husbands, while men covenanted to hearken to God. After 1990, both men and women covenant directly with God. It was a step, albeit a small one, towards more spiritual equality in the ceremony. Even the temple clothing was modified to be simpler and easier to manage. The overall effect was to make the ceremony shorter, less intimidating, and more focused on Christ. The church seemed to be strategically shifting the focus away from the more esoteric, Masonic elements inherited from the 19th century and towards a more universally accessible, Christ-centered message. This makes sense in the context of a church trying to become a global religion. Rituals that might have made sense to early pioneers in Utah were simply not resonating with a diverse international membership in the late 20th century. Here is my first question for you to answer in the comments. If you were a faithful member in 1990, would the removal of the penalties have made you more or less confident in the Church's divine guidance? It's a tricky one, right? On one hand, it's a positive change. On the other, it implies the ceremony wasn't perfect to begin with. Now, let's explore a more tactical reason for the change. And this is where things get really interesting: the timing. Why April 1990? Specifically, some researchers point to a major legal case happening at the time. A lawsuit had been filed against the church related to the actions of a man who had murdered his sister-in-law and her baby. The defense tried to argue that Mormon temple oaths had contributed to his violent mindset, a claim that was ultimately weak but generated terrifying headlines. The blood atonement concept from the Brigham Young era, combined with the temple penalties, created a potent and dangerous narrative in the media. By removing the penalties, the church wasn't just cleaning up its image, it was proactively disarming a potential legal and public relations bomb. It was a strategic, tactical move to protect the institution. By eliminating the most controversial part of the ceremony, they removed the primary piece of evidence critics were using to link the church to violence. It was a brilliant, if silent, checkmate. And here's another question for you. Do you think the church should have been transparent and announced the changes, explaining the reasons, or was a silent, unannounced change the better strategy to avoid drawing even more attention to it? Let me know your thoughts below. Ultimately, the 1990 changes reveal a fascinating tension within the LDS Church, the tension between revelation and adaptation. The church presents its temple ordinances as ancient, eternal, and revealed by God. Yet, the 1990 overhaul proves that these ceremonies are not static. They can and do change in response to social, cultural, and even legal pressures. It shows an institution that is capable of pragmatism and strategic adaptation, even in its most sacred spaces. For believers, this can be seen as continuing revelation, with God guiding the church to adapt its practices for a new era. For critics, it's seen as evidence that the ceremonies are man-made and that the leadership is essentially a board of directors making strategic business decisions. What's undeniable is that the temple you attend today is significantly different from the one your grandparents attended. And the catalyst for that change was a confluence of external pressure from critics, internal discomfort from members, and a savvy, forward-thinking leadership that knew when it was time to evolve. It wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm. So, one final question for our comment section. What other changes, big or small, have you noticed in the church over the years that made you stop and think? The story of the 1990 temple changes is a powerful case study in how modern religions navigate tradition and change. It's a story of secrecy, strategy, and the silent evolution of the sacred. If you found this deep dive as fascinating as I did, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. We unpack complex topics like this every single week, and your support helps us continue to bring these hidden histories to light. Also, drop your answers to my questions in the comments below. I read every single one, and I am genuinely curious to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.